by our strategy planning and analysis group, the Bighorn Company and Aspect Strategies. We have Dan Conway and Mike Smith. And Stephanie. Hello, it's like here to kick it off. So
Let's see which way she's coming. Stay over there. Come on, get out. Suddenly I feel safer.
Well, good morning, everybody. For those online, my name is Dan Conway. I'm the Director of Strategy and Budget. And I'm going to take this opportunity to review briefly with everyone here the 2023 general fund picture and kind of where we're standing with 24 and 25. This is the exact same information that was provided to the commissioners on May 23rd. What you see on the screen here is a copy of that packet was provided to them. It includes both what was provided as a PowerPoint as well as handouts. This information was also presented to the county manager's leadership team 2 weeks ago. So we want to make sure that all the elected officials receive the same information. So the first thing we want to talk to you about is give an update on Tabor. So Jeannie, if you could go to the next slide. So this is a recap of 2023 and the Tabor fiscal year spending limit, which as a reminder is the overall revenue limit. And the column on the left represents what was budgeted or anticipated for those revenues. And the column on the right represents what actually came to fruition at the end of the year. And so the main takeaways here is that in 2023's budget, we anticipated a total refund of approximately $24.7 million. And as the year closed out, it was calculated that our Tabor limit did increase and allowed us to retain a little bit more revenue. But despite that, we still have a refund of about $30.5 million. And the two primary factors that are driving the Tabor revenue limit is going to be the what's called the local growth factor, which is the net valuation of property within the county or the net change of acquisition of property and destruction of property, and then the local inflation, the CPI. So those two factors we don't know until once the year's closed out. So if we adopt the budget. So for instance, when we adopted the 2023 budget, we had to forecast that in August of 2022. We didn't know the final 23 Tabor limit until April of 2024. So it's kind of always an after the fact because we had to wait for those CPI figures and all those other factors to be calculated in. So as a result, again, our limit did increase slightly, and the nature of how much we have to refund has changed a little bit. We will be refunding about $8.6 million of non-property tax revenue. That's going to be grants, interests, fees, and then $21.9 million of property tax revenue. That's a little bit less than we anticipated, largely due to the Board of Equalization process and the abatement of property taxes and those type of processes. And so in total is about $30.5 million. So that will inform then going forward how it shapes our picture for 24 and 25 and going forward. So next slide, if you would, Jeannie. This is just now a picture of what we're anticipating for 24's limit. Again, we developed at this time. We won't know until April of 25 what it turns out to be, but it does increase a little bit. Right now, to date, we've brought in, as of May 15th, we've brought in about 32% of our total limit. And that's not unusual for this time of year because property tax usually comes in first part of the year. And that's the blue part of that chart you see, and then the other taxes that come in. The next slide is just a breakdown of the property tax limit. So as a reminder, there's two limits with Tabor. Those are overall revenue limit, and a subset of that is another limit, and that's just on property tax. And so that's the anticipated limit that we're looking at for 24. And again, we've received the majority of our property taxes through this year. June is another big month when we get the other half of people who are on installment plans for property taxes to come in. So everything's pretty much looking on track. We have a little bit more wiggle room with our property tax limit. The one big takeaway, and it's a continuing message that we've had up to this point, please continue to pursue grants. We want to make sure we're maximizing as much revenue as we can, and we'll monitor this limit as we go throughout the year. Next slide, please. All right, so go to next. Next, we want to shift our focus to the general fund specifically and our outlook potentially for 25. So what you're seeing here is what was provided and calculated in October last year. So this was early estimates. This is before 23 was closed out. And what we saw in the general fund is that we anticipated a deficit, an operating deficit in the general fund, and that's the column on the far right for 2024 of about $16.6 million. And let me kind of orient you a little bit to this table here. So at the top part, you see the starting fund balance, or at least anticipated starting fund balance. Then we see revenues coming in, expenditures going out, the net position there, and then that ending amount, that green row. And then from that balance, there's reserve designations. We have an operating reserve of about $32 million. That's prescribed to maintain about 3 months of operating expenses. And then in past years, we had a little bit set aside for capital. So when we looked at when we adopted our 24 budget, we had just enough to meet that $32 million reserve threshold. So that was the figures we saw in 23. Go to the next slide. So then when we carried this out into the out years, and these are based on budgeted values, we saw that in 25, the column after that highlighted column, we are anticipating just under $30 million of a deficit. And so this informed our conversations with everyone around the county, all of our departments and offices, about identifying potential general fund spending reductions. That was a preliminary target. I was going to remind you. At the time when we shared it, we expected it to change as we got actuals and the years closed out. But that was the number we needed to work with because it's a large exercise, as you all recall, to go through and identify potential reduction options for consideration. And this was also done to help inform the conversation that you'll hear shortly and how we engaged with the community about identifying potential impacts to our services. So this was, again, what was presented in October 23 as a preliminary estimate. Go to the next slide. All right, so then this again is what I spoke to, just the breakdown of the reduction targets. These are all just available for you for reference. We won't go in detail on this today. G, go on the next slide. Okay, so now let's look at how 23 ended. Now we're shifting back to 23. Why are we looking at 23? Well, because 23 informs where we landed 24 and then where we're projected to be 25. Our adopted budget, we are anticipating to end with a $59 million balance. And then our amended budget, as supplementals came in, grants, et cetera, we anticipated a deficit of about 11.1. The year actually ended at 23 with a positive $10 million. So instead of us ending with a fund balance of 59 million that we initially anticipated at the end of 23, we have ended with a fund balance of 69.8 million at the end of 23, which is good news. That means we have a little bit more cash to work with going into 24 and 25. So next slide.
Dan, can you talk about that swing a little bit?
Yeah, I'll get to that in the next slide.
I just to clarify, so 22, our fund balance was 12.8 million less than we anticipated. 23 was 10.8 million more than we anticipated.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's budgeting. In a budget this big, that's not unusual.
No, it's not unusual. It's you can have those type of variations from year to year depending on the different types of situations that arise. We have been pretty accurate the last several years on 5% variance to our budget to actuals year after year, and so it does have swings, but it's usually with a small margin. So Joe will talk a little bit more about what the factors are here. So if you can go to the next slide. Actually go to the next couple. These are just on your packet. These are available. This is just a breakdown of the categories within the revenue. And the next one is a breakdown of the expenditure categories. If you have questions about those, just wanted to share that with you. Next slide. All right. So this is really where the bulk of the conversation that we wanted to share with you today. So we see on the left here, the 23 actual, and then we have 24 and 25. This is kind of a before and after picture. So the white columns represent what we saw when we adopted the budget, when we took a look at it in October last year. The updated ones, that the highlighted columns, are now what we see with those year-end figures in place. Also, our forecasts have been updated because we're now able to look at actuals to determine our trends going into the out years. That's been problematic in recent years for two reasons. One, we were still transitioning from J.D. Edwards to Workday, our financial system. So the data, we didn't have a lot of great historical data to fall back on. And most importantly, we were still in those pandemic influenced years. And so when you look at trends using pandemic years, that are certainly an anomaly, and we didn't want to trend out those anomalous years to be kind of the norm. So now that we have a few more years behind us, we were able to look at these forecasts on a more actual data basis. So our forecasts have updated. The two main things to look at. When we look at 24, adopted budget revenue of 256 million and the updated forecast of 263 million. The reason that's jumping so much higher is two main factors. One, our Tabor limit has increased and allowing us to retain more revenue. And two, our interest earnings have swung around and have much more earnings. So those are the two driving factors to bring us in more revenue into the general fund.
So Dan, can I just underscore that too? So when you talk about Tabor allowing us to keep more, that ties directly back to inflation, right? As part of the
Correct,
which
the
we talked about
8%.
earlier.
Yeah, that historical 8% inflation allowed that limit to go up.
Right, exactly. So I think that's really important to underscore because typically this doesn't happen.
No.
Unfortunately, because of inflation increasing.
Yeah, we're usually seeing any given year about 2 to 3%, 4 on the high end for inflation. So it was definitely an anomalous year.
So I think last year you mentioned that we raised about $22 million in interest, but how much of that do we have to get back through the Tabor refund, or are we able to keep the 22 million
8.6 is how much we'll have to refund.
of that?
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
23.
We're gonna be higher this year.
Yeah.
Yep,
So
exactly.
whatever that is with the mark-to-market adjustment and then the refund, that net amount will be, so you're doing your job. We just have restrictions with the Tabor limit, you know?
Get that clear.
But it's better,
Good time
yeah.
together, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, can I just make a quick point? Can you go back to the revenue slide? I just want to share how important it is to. Well, this is it. So let me just walk you through this. So remember how Dan talked about how we set the Tabor limit in advance of actually knowing what it is? And so for property taxes, if we would have estimated that, not realizing that we were going to hit 8% inflation, and if we would have done a temporary mill levy adjustment
Up front.
upfront, which is what we've been asked to do, but we don't know what the number is until 4 months after the year closes, we would have ratcheted ourselves down $4.2 million. So we would have intentionally lowered the amount of revenue that we would be allowed to keep under Tabor if we do a temporary mill levy adjustment in advance. That is why we recommend doing it when we know what it is, because there's so many factors. We already have struggles with revenue, but ratcheting our own selves down by setting that temporary mill levy adjustment in advance could hurt us.
You're talking about upfront, we're lowering it when the property tax bills
Right.
go out.
Yeah.
That's not what you want to do.
We don't want to do that
That's
because
right.
if we would have done a temporary mill levy adjustment, we would have reduced our revenue by $4.2 million.
And I think the board was very much in support of that. And we had a lot of
Absolutely.
constituents who
Right.
spoke to us to say, what can you do? Can you help? Can you ratchet it down? We talked about the legislative remedy and more, but that would have been a huge hit for us.
Yeah. Well, and the other
And
thing
it would have
is,
continued in out years.
they don't
Right.
understand because they don't understand that we're setting it in advance. And they go through and after the year closes, they come up and they do the calculation to say, this is what you should have reduced the mill levy to. Well, we know after the fact, but we're setting it in advance. So that's the disconnect, I think. But it is important for us to actually recognize that revenue growth because we do need it to be able to fund the projects that our community is used to receiving. The reason why we have that is because inflation. This helped us from a revenue perspective, But from a cost perspective, we're all still kind of catching up to that. So we're gonna have those increased costs going forward. But anyway, I wanted to share that because I think that's important and a lot of people don't understand how that temporary mill levy adjustment could hurt us based on the revenue, the Tabor revenue limit formula. So sorry about that.
No, it's good. Thank you.
Yeah. But again, the reason why we're not at a $30 million deficit is because of inflation. And that inflation allowed us to keep that much additional revenue. And that additional revenue allowed us to be, right now, we're estimating about an $18 million deficit. We're going to be working with you all because we forecasted that based on actuals. And we all know that you have projects and programs that haven't realized that inflationary cost. We need to talk to you about making sure that that estimate and that forecast is the right number. So that deficit could grow a little bit. And so when we have that budget meeting with you and we're talking about our forecast for 24 and 25, that's what we really want to focus in on. Okay.
So to that point, we can now see that with those updated forecasts for 25, instead of that early projection of that $32 million deficit, we're looking about just under 18 million. So we still have a gap between our revenue expenditures, but just not as significant as we initially intended. You can see between the estimates and the values that were adopted, the expenditures are relatively flat. There's not many changes. We refined it a little bit, but the big swings we see are really in the revenue and those starting balances.
So where does the 9 million roll back into that 17? Or that, not 18?
So
It's
that,
off the top side.
Yeah, the 30, right?
Yeah, so our revenues are net of all the refunds. So this is
Right.
what we're allowed to keep. So that happens sort of, we have gross property taxes collected, so you're collecting those. We keep about 24% of those. We net out the refund. And on our financial statements, we take the net of what we're allowed to keep.
so that 268
Yeah.
for 2025 for revenue, that includes an anticipated refund.
So with the $9 million,
That would go into the fund balance, which is not a lot for a fund this large going forward for a fallback. And as you can see, in the last, for 24 and 25, there's not any capital reserves identified. And that was one of the mechanisms that was identified in the 24 budget to try to balance it. That's not great considering the capital needs that we have. So 25, these are just forecasts. Obviously, that's part of the process we're embarking on now to develop the 25 budget. The commissioners will have those decisions in front of them in the coming months with all of your help to help prioritize and identify all those needs. And this is just one piece of that.
but are you still recommending a 12% budget cut across the board for departments?
So all the reduction options that were identified will be provided back to the board in August for their decisions. And we have to look at a variety of factors, our capital needs, potential more revenue loss that we're seeing with some legislation coming down, amongst many other factors. And then have them go through and prioritize and identify those on that list that may be necessary. The board may choose to do some, may choose to do none, may choose to do all, but that's part of the dialogue that will take place in a couple.
When you say none, what do you mean?
Well, we identified about $26 million of that $32 million target that departments and offices submitted. I think the point here is that now the commissioners aren't in a place where they have to choose anything on that list. There's some flexibility to prioritize some of those options should the board decide to go forward with identifying some reductions.
And I would just add too, Jerry, a couple quick thoughts. One, I think that the board is also interested in looking at, are there any other one-time savings? And I know that that doesn't help us in the years out. I recognize that completely. That would help further shrink that 12% budget cut component. When we were working with some of those percentages, we were thinking it might be more in the range of 6 to 7% in terms of cuts. We have to talk about the timing so people are aware of that sooner rather than later. And then another component of that is, are there certain prioritizations that we want to do per department? So the next step, of course, as Stephanie and Dan have talked about, is meeting one-on-one with departments. Correct me if I'm wrong, was the goal to have those meetings completed by, was it June 27th, 26th?
So, no, we will be presenting the preliminary budget in July. We will be meeting with the board to discuss some of those factors actually next week, 2 weeks from now, to discuss what will go into that preliminary. But all the departments and offices, when they come back and present to the board, will take place in August. So that'll be all the decision packages, the general fund reduction options, and that's when those individual conversations take place.
We're starting those meetings
But we,
now.
staff are
But that's what I'm talking
working
about.
with departments to identify actuals and trends. to see where those numbers will be
Yeah,
for those
Dan,
conversations.
that's the specific piece I'm
Okay.
talking about. I'm asking specifically about that point, and if you could talk a little bit about that, just so everyone is in the
Different
mix.
Departments.
Yeah,
Correct, because I remember, I thought that we had talked about that,
Yes.
but I may have that date wrong. Because I'm sure there are questions about, when do we talk with SPA to have that next round of conversations, which then comes to the board. And I, for some reason, had that June 26th, 27th date in terms of the SPA team specifically working with departments to have these conversations and maybe having them wrapped up around then to then continue the conversations moving forward.
we'll
Can
have
you
a-
just address that piece?
Yeah,
so
we'll have
people are in the
we'll have
mix?
some of those conversations, but not necessarily all of them that time. The 27th is when we'll have another budget planning meeting with the board to discuss some of those factors. But at this time of year, the SPA budget team is working with all of you to review your quarterly figures in anticipation of the next quarterly update. And that also fits in timely with our budget development. And we want to revisit, all right, what reduction options did you identify initially? Are they still relevant? Do they need to be revised a little bit? How are our actuals looking in the trend out for the rest of the year? Are there things that we can't just see readily by pulling the numbers out of the system? Oh, maybe there's something that still needs to happen. It just isn't showing yet, or this is a one-time, we don't want to trend that out. So we need to get to that a little deeper sophistication trajectory on those actuals. And those are the conversations that are taking place here. Already are, will continue on for the next several weeks to try to continue to inform those conversations.
There's kind of like two things happening really quick. So one of them is more about forecasting what your spending is to make sure that we have the right amount of expenditures identified, because we're looking at historical actuals. There could be a number of factors that drive an increased expenditure for a following year. So that's sort of the first conversation. The second conversation will happen really after our June 27th meeting about reductions. And that's where we get a little bit more guidance around what we want to do for reductions, where we're having a conversation with departments to say, did anything change? Do you actually need to change what was submitted for your reduction? Are you happy with what was submitted? What are some of the concerns you have? We're also talking to the department collectively, because not only are we talking about a general fund reduction, but we're also talking about the ARPA positions ending. And so some departments are heavily utilizing those to be able to meet the current volume that they have. And so we could really have a detrimental impact to a department. And so we want to have those conversations and bring that information back to the board as we're talking through how do we really make sure we're meeting some of those service levels that are critical and that we need to do because of the volume in the community that we're required to do and balance those out. But luckily we do have wiggle room. So it's not a one and done conversation. You definitely should be talking to your SPA analyst consistently.
Can I follow up on the timeline? So when you say the first meeting about spending and all of that, the second meeting, so you're saying should take place sometime between the end of June when you meet with the board and
July.
end of
July.
July, so somewhere in July.
As you
Okay.
prepare for those decision package submittals and
Mhm.
that type of thing, that's when you'll be working closely with your
Okay.
partner to identify those.
When do you plan on scheduling those meetings?
It's up to each individual department and our SPA budget
Should
team
we
reach out.
Or
They
should
should-
we wait?
They should reach out to you if they haven't. Feel free to cut me an email and I'll pass it along.
Yeah.
But yeah, we want to get that
If
scheduled.
you want to be proactive and get it on the calendar,
Yeah.
do it.
I know how to schedule.
It's my favorite thing. July is a rough one.
Is it?
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And I think the team's listening in, so we should get on that.
So Dan, having gone through we were talking about Plan A and Plan B, right? And so the budget projections, the reduction process that we went through earlier this year, that's kind of part of the Plan B piece, which is if we have to reduce, how are we going to go about doing that? So departments previously identified 12.5%, give or take, in reductions. And so as a department, if I brought forward my targeted reductions that I was expected to make, and let's say in my case, there were 5 of them, do I have the chance to reprioritize those 5 at this point, knowing that it's a possibility I may not have to make those 12.5% reductions? It may be something less, like Commissioner Dahlkemper was referencing. So can I reprioritize? And when when would I be doing that during this time frame you're talking about?
Absolutely. And so, in fact, we encourage you to, if you need to revisit those reduction options that were submitted, whether they're reprioritized, this one we would rather try to avoid over another, or that maybe one option when it was identified in October, November last year, now isn't really viable and you want to do a different one or change the scale of them. Absolutely. Please revisit those. And the timeline is the same situation. Work on that in July. And then those will be presented in August. So all of those decision points will be presented to the board in August, including those reduction options if they need to have any revisions to that.
And we're going to be talking about guidance from the board on June 27th. And so we'll be sending out more specific information after the June 27th meeting.
See, my concern about that is you're talking to the board before you talk to all of the departments about what our priorities are. So they hear, well, we can't cut 6%, we can't cut 12%. I mean, you know how I am. We're labor. We don't have machines. We don't have guns. We don't have buildings. But what we do is bring all the money in and invest it. And if we don't do our job, nobody does our job. Nobody does their job. And so I would like the board to understand the importance of each department and what they do within the bigger synergy of this county. So I'd like to talk to somebody and say, we had identified $235,000 in cuts, but now because of this change, I would like to eliminate one of those cuts because we are people. We're not, like I said, machines and everything else.
To be clear, the board will not be making any decisions until they hear from everybody. And that'll be part of those conversations in August.
Yeah. So the guidance, the general guidance on June 27th isn't like, okay, the treasurers submitted this, we're taking all of those. It's going to be, what are some one-time monies that we can use? How much are we actually asking departments to reduce out of their budget? Then departments will have the opportunity to move forward. There'll be some criteria that we all work through so that we're trying to be consistent and equitable across our organization. And so those are the things that we're going to talk about on June 27th. But the board isn't going to go through and say, out of the list of everything that was submitted, take these reductions. They're not going to be doing that level. And so we'll have criteria that we're going to be submitting, and you'll have the opportunity to look at your department. Some things may have changed, and then you have the opportunity to meet those.
I just have to watch Andy because I don't know.
For sure.
And it's, we basically have like 20 different business units. We all do so many different things. And so it's not like a
Okay.
cookie cutter approach. And we have to really look at our business and the services that we're providing to make sure that those make sense.
One of the things that you all said you were interested in was comparing our legal obligations to our ability to cut from our budget. And I'm just unclear where that's happening in this.
Yeah, to determine mandates, it's definitely something we're going to have to, partner with the county attorney's office. We're going to need to lean heavily on each of you to help us navigate that because, collectively, that's a massive endeavor. So we certainly will need your help to say, hey, these reductions can't happen because of this mandate and help us direct us to that. So we'll leave that at this stage.
So has that analysis been happening in the background
Not yet,
between
no.
our submissions and now?
It's a pretty significant project that we need to figure out how to implement that. And that's not something that we're going to have in place for 2025. Honestly, when you think about all of the different services that have mandates against them, all at different levels and the ways in which they're written, that's probably like an 18-month to 2-year process to really have that in place that's in a meaningful way. And so as we do this, we're trying to balance the fact that we need time to be able to continue to do work with looking at some of those one-time ways for us to balance our budget to continue to give us time to actually make those strategic steps. So I can expect that this is probably, in order for us to get to a place where revenues cover our expenditures and we have a balanced budget is a couple years away. If we're going to do that without making some really hard decisions and not really understanding mandates and things like that.
I would add just to that, during the 3-day work session we had with the commissioners to review those initial submissions, some of the comments I heard pretty consistently from the commissioners was that they recognize all of you are the subject matter experts in your areas, and they do look towards your expertise for that guidance. So I think that was expressed quite readily.
I also wanted to just mention really quick, go ahead.
I just have a question.
Yep.
To confirm in my head, because it sounds like what you're saying is it's not going to be a straight across the board cut.
Correct.
it will be decided as to different cut allocations for different entities.
We're going to try to develop some evaluation criteria, present that to the board for consideration to help them decide what approach they want to take.
Tied into these issues related to mandates and other.
Yeah.
Mhm. And community wants and needs.
One quick follow-up question to internal communications. Can you talk more about how we're helping our team members understand the timeline, the key decisions moving forward and what that looks like?
Mhm.
So everyone has the same information, knowing it could change here and there, but I think these are great questions that are coming up.
So we have a couple ways we are continuing to communicate. We send out a monthly update, a budget update email that kind of gives the highlights of the next steps, update community dates. We also have each of our SPA budget team members work individually with your areas. And I think most of you have standing meetings with those folks to keep that communication channel open. We also have open office hours, I think every Wednesday with the SPA budget team that anybody can call in and ask any questions and support. So those are some of our three current levels of outreach that we have.
So you're suggesting that we talk to our analysts sooner than later? Yeah. Because we talk monthly, but
Yes.
is monthly enough still? When if we talk,
As much as you can, and how much time on your calendar to afford it. So, yeah, because we got some big decisions in front of us. We want to get as much information and collaboration as we can.
Dan, two other questions for you. One is regarding capital reserves. So as I understand it, one of the ways in which we balanced the budget for 2024 was to rely on that $7.6 million that was in capital reserves. So theoretically, that has been zeroed out.
Correct.
Right? So as part of the updated projections, I would assume that we're going to be looking at the budget process for next year to see if there's any way to potentially restore some of those capital reserves.
That's going to be one of the decisions that we're going to be presented to the commissioners for consideration. Yeah. Because capital need is obviously a mounting concern for the county with our approximately $500 million over 10 years. And our transportation and facility backlog of capital, 7.6 million, even with that barely scratches the surface. I'll remind everybody that we were fortunate that we had that set aside, 22, I think it was, when we had the fire water line break happen in this building, and it was very expensive, and those are things that are, emergency situations that come up. Without that, that reserve, it creates some really difficult situations. So we are going to look and see, are there ways we can start to focus on capital, which speaks to our efforts to try to develop a more distinct standalone CIP process, capital improvement process, to give that more focus and spotlight, kind of separate those decision makings from our operational needs.
You've also referred to decision packages a couple of times today. So I automatically go to, if we're still having budget reductions for 2024, not as severe as we originally anticipated, but if we're still seeing reductions, why are we allowing for decision packages to be submitted? Because that's typically meaning we're asking for more money.
Sure. So it's important to remember that decision packages aren't just around general fund. We have 38 county funds that we have to make sure they're accounted for in the overall process. So often a lot of those will be in open space or road bridge fund. So we make sure that those are accounted for. So that when we say decision packages, it's looking at the entire package. At this point, the budget staff is recommending to the board that we don't go forward with any general fund operating decision packages, but that's a decision the board will have to make, not budget staff, but that's part of the recommendation, just given the light of the outlook for the general fund.
so for example, we've had a $10,000 increase on postage. So you're saying we're not going to be able to ask for the decision package of $10,000 more in postage?
That's going to be part of the direction that we need to receive from the.
And that's an operating thing that makes the department do what we do. So I mean, I wouldn't say you should cut off all general fund requests. I mean, the board should be able to look at them and say yes or no to each one individually.
I have a question. So on the decision package, is that the route that we take to ask for grant funded positions being made into maybe a full-time employee?
Yeah.
So
That would be
that
the
was still
plan.
general fund, but it's, okay.
Yeah, and if it's tied to the ARPA, that'll be part of that whole package.
Yeah, and so ARPA's kind of in the air too of how long those last.
And these are some of the points.
Percentage.
Yeah, these are some of the points we're going to be discussing with the board on the 27th.
Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of these are great questions, but the decisions haven't been made yet.
Okay.
There's an ARPA presentation on the 18th, next Tuesday, to talk about those specific general fund or ARPA funded positions. And then on the 27th, we'll have more direction around reduction. So yeah, any concerns you have, please let us know. Please obviously, share with the commissioners. We want to make sure that we're as comprehensive as possible. But we're also trying to look at ways where we balance 25, where we still have time to be strategic behind the scenes with things that are important.
One of the things that's running out along with ARPA is we were not able to see any positive results from legislation this year regarding BOCC funding, which supports a number of FTEs in both my office and the sheriff's office. And so that was something that was unknown in January. And the cuts may go up to 60%, but we're estimating right now we're 30% statewide. And so that will affect every victim services organization and the system side too.
Yeah, legislation is one of the big unknowns. That's, I mean,
We know now.
that part of we
That
know.
one, yeah, there's a lot of
$3
things
million
that
on
are
a $40
negatively
million
impacting that.
Yeah, and it speaks to that. I know there's an initiative that's been certified to go to the voters this fall. I think it's initiative 50 that would have changed the assessment rate for property taxes, and that has the potential to, in 26, have us lose $50 to $20 million right off the top of the property taxes. Or more. So there's a lot of factors that are right there on the edge that we need to make just, strategically now, because we have to kind of know what's coming down the road.
When you're talking about ARPA funding, I just want you to realize that the BOCC funding will also affect FTEs significantly this year, which we were hoping it was.
Yeah.
ARPA question real quick. When you say that you're meeting to discuss ARPA, is that more of like an overview of here are all the positions funded by ARPA, this is where they live, not direction from the board to say keep those, don't keep those, or because we have feelings about certain positions. We've already budgeted to not exist. We've already thought ahead on some of these things.
Yeah.
Communicated that with the staff, so.
So the briefing paper that was turned in, that's going to be presented on Tuesday, has a list of the 90 plus positions, which also includes the sheriff's office positions, those the 40. And we do have interest income that was earned, significant interest income on ARPA. And so there's also been some savings on some ARPA projects. And so the ARPA team is going to share how much money is available through savings of projects that didn't utilize all the funds, as well as the interest income. And then also show the positions that are planned to end at the end of 24. And the request that will be made is that those positions are requested if needed through the decision package process against those ARPA funds that are available. So this wouldn't be a general fund impact. This would be all of the interest income and savings within ARPA.
Okay.
So that's the position that the ARPA team is taking on Tuesday. Please listen in and weigh in.
Yeah.
That's happening on Tuesday, and so we'll know more, and then we'll know more on June 27th.
But isn't that just putting a Band-Aid on it again?
It is. It's a temporary. It's not a long-term fix. But in terms of those programs and the support that is needed now, until we really understand and can actually, fund the services that we're delivering, we are looking at ways until we can strategically get there. It's not an easy thing. We probably need 2 years to really be able to take the revenues and match them and be able to pay for the services we're doing. So it is a Band-Aid.
Those are the restricted positions. I mean, those are.
The grant-funded ARPA positions.
Yeah, so there's limitations on what those positions can do. So I'm not flipping that position into something relevant, and not like,
I understand.
Investigation or something like that, so.
This has been great conversation. There's a lot more conversations to happen, and if it feels like there's, anxiety and needs and we're not communicating enough, we may look at actually having another planning workshop around budgeting and reductions. If that's so desired, we could certainly add more time to have these conversations. Okay. I'm not sure how much more we have, but
I think that's it for this. I think we need probably move on to kind of that plan A.
Plan A. So I'd like to Okay, okay, sorry.
Thank you very much.
We'll stay here to help support the
Okay.
conversation, but want to
Mike,
come in.
your team. Thank you. Just bring your chairs up.
Thank you, cousin.
But she needs to feel free to see what people come down.
Come on
or
over.
call.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And we also, for those of you who may want a hard copy of this presentation, we do have some available.
Sorry, I was like,
Buy them all.
can you go, Alex? If you- you know, Jeannie?
Oh, we don't have-
Mike, you're gonna.
You're guys gonna do the call tonight? Yeah, I can. So, thanks, Annette. So with us today, we've got Manny from the Bighorn Company and then Alex from Aspect. So they've been helping us out over the last about 8 months. But I know we've talked a few times since then about this overall project. So they'll walk through everything we've done in terms of research into past issues and then the current situation, along with 3 phases of polling results. So they've got quite a bit of information, so I'll let them jump into it.
Thanks so much, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Manny. I'm a partner at the Bighorn Company. Up to the next slide here, I'll give a quick overview of what we're covering today. We're going to have some very quick introductions, and then we're going to talk about our project findings, which broadly break down to 2 categories, ballot measure research and development, and then a very expansive community outreach process. We have a lot of material to cover, so we may or may not have time for Q&A at the end. If we run out of time for that, we're happy to field questions one-on-one or do follow-up meetings or whatever else. So definitely don't guy with questions even if we hit time today before we're able to get there. Hop to the next slide and the next one. So as I mentioned, my name is Manny Gidsfar. I'm a partner at the Bighorn Company. We're a political consulting firm. Our team has worked at various levels of government in Colorado, including the state legislature, as well as at the local level. And we specialize in ballot initiatives at both the state and local level. So let my colleague Alex introduce himself and his firm.
Hey all, thanks for having us. My name is Alex Stud. I'm with Aspect Strategic. We've done the public opinion research, all 3 phases. Like Bighorn Company, we also work a lot with county governments, municipal governments, statewide ballot measures, with ballot measures really being one of our core focuses. So happy to be here today, and I'll give it back to Manny.
Thank you. Go to hop to the next slide. So just a quick overview of the project and its objectives. We are here to explore potential ballot solutions to the county's ongoing funding challenges. 2 primary objectives here. The first is to conduct a thorough fact-finding process to evaluate all the potential options and whether or not submitting a funding question or questions to voters at the November 2024 ballot is the best strategic path forward. And then using this fact-finding process to provide a final recommendation. So what we're talking about today is item number 1, the complete findings of the fact-finding process, and excited to walk you all through our work over the past 8 months. And then for those of you who were around for the initial project plan presentations, you might remember this. This is the strategic considerations and kind of guiding questions that we've been aiming to answer throughout this project, really trying to keep an open mind, not start with an answer that we want and work backwards from there, but have a very open-ended investigatory process, really laying out a list of questions we aim to answer and then doing the research and community outreach work necessary to answer them. So throughout this presentation, you'll see these questions in subtitles and things like that, and I'll also maybe call attention to them as we go through. And then one final thing before we jump in, we're going to talk about a few different potential ballot solutions today. We just want to emphasize that if a ballot measure is ultimately referred, the final decision will rest with the voters. Voter approval is necessary for every single potential ballot solution we're going to discuss throughout this presentation. And all of these potential ballot solutions are expressly authorized by Article 10, Section 20 of the Colorado Constitution, also referred to as TABOR. We're big believers in the right of Colorado voters to approve or reject proposed revenue measures, and all of the work on this project comes from that core principle. I think we've seen the perception sometimes that these potential revenue solutions are somehow in conflict in TABOR, and they're in fact directly authorized by TABOR. And one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through here with respect to the questions around how the county can communicate with the public about this process and provide public education on its funding challenges and potential solutions, there is a lot of confusion around what Tabor says and does. So we try and make that very clear throughout this presentation. The project findings, to start out, we'll look at ballot measure research and development. So two big components of this. The first is our comparable ballot measure analysis. We looked at election results and ballot language of 96 total revenue raising measures presented to voters in both Jefferson County and comparable Colorado County since 2012. We limited the time window to 2012 or later because of how much Jefferson County has changed politically since that time. In our analysis, it did not make a ton of sense to reach back much further than that. Difficult to draw conclusions from historical election results much earlier than that, just given the political changes in the county over the past decade. These measures are divided into three categories. There's Jefferson County ballot measures, there's county level results of statewide ballot measures, and then there are also ballot measures from comparable counties. And a quick definition of terms: when we say comparable counties, we acknowledge that no other county is exactly like Jeffco, but we tried to focus on counties that were similar enough in demographics, population, and political makeup to provide enough data points from which we could identify trends in the results of a broad range of county level measures. So the counties we looked at broadly fall into two categories. There's counties with a similar political lean to Jefferson County. So that's Arapahoe, Adams County, Larimer County, and La Plata County. U.S. Senate race, as it was the most recent statewide political contest with the highest voter turnout in a general election at the time that we did this analysis. Then we also looked at high population Front Range counties with counterbalancing political leans. So we also looked at El Paso County, Douglas County, Denver County, and Boulder County. And then we also, for this part of the project, did an analysis of the county's financial needs and potential revenue solutions in collaboration with SPA, which has a deceptively relaxing department name, I gotta say, and the county project team. Huge thanks to the SPA team for all their help throughout this project. So let's dive into the findings. So first, we're going to talk about the available options, and this comes from looking at these 96 measures in Jeffco and other counties, really trying to boil it down to, at the county level, what are the different levers you can potentially pull to seek voter approval for revenue solutions. So the first policy or ballot measure option, that we looked at is revenue retention measures. These are sometimes also referred to in fiscal policy circles as debrucing measures. That's actually a label we tend to avoid. It's something that I have used as a shorthand previously, but the more I've learned about fiscal policy in Colorado, I actually don't like the debrucing label. I think it creates the impression that these revenue retention measures are somehow, I guess context for where debrucing comes from. It's named after sort of the architect of Tabor, Douglas Bruce.
Triple felon.
Yeah. And so I think what I don't like about this label is it implies that these revenue retention measures are somehow in opposition to Tabor or somehow sticking it to Doug Bruce and Tabor when they are in fact authorized by Tabor. They involve seeking voter authorization, which is kind of a core ideological concept in Tabor, is the voters ultimately decide and the voters ultimately have a seat at the table for these decisions. So, I've seen in discussion around potential revenue solutions in this county and lots of other places in Colorado, frankly, some people feel that a revenue retention measure is somehow getting rid of Tabor, which is absolutely not the case. They do not increase tax or mill levy rates. Revenue retention measures are expressly authorized by Tabor, and the only thing they affect is the revenue limits component. So other components of Tabor, such as mandatory voter approval of tax or debt increases, are not affected regardless of whether or not a revenue retention measure is approved or rejected by voters. In terms of the different things that revenue retention measures can do, they can be broad, so that's exempting all revenues without a time limit and allowing them to be spent on a broad range of functions and services, or narrow, so they're limited in some way. So either limited to only specific revenues, or limited only to specific time periods with a sunset clause, or limited to only certain functions. So if we can jump to the next slide here. So one thing we did look at, and this is the one place in our analysis where we went into the past a little bit beyond 2012, is all 6 county level broad revenue retention measures that were presented to voters in comparable counties were approved. Voters in 50 of Colorado's 64 counties have approved broad revenue retention measures to provide relief from total revenue limits. And the majority of these measures were approved by voters in the decade or so following the 1992 passage of Tabor. There are numerous more recent examples of successful countywide broad revenue retention measures. Voters in an additional 12 Colorado counties have approved narrow revenue retention measures to provide relief from total revenue limits. So this is one of the nuances of there's different levels of narrow. So this is sort of on the broader end of narrow, if that at all makes sense. The idea is that these measures apply to all revenues, but the retained revenues were limited to certain uses, or the relief from the revenue limit was sunsetted, or different constraints like that. So Jefferson County is in a pretty exclusive club here, as it's one of just 2 Colorado counties with no revenue retention measure to provide relief from total revenue limits.
Is the other one?
Weld County.
But they have, oh, yes.
And that's not to say there are no revenues in Jefferson County. I believe you said, this was the open space fund, library. So here and there are funds that are not subject to the revenue limits, but overall, a large portion of the county's funds are still subject. Jump to the next one here. Other policy options that we observed in other counties, as well as sort of limited examples in recent history for Jeffco, is a sales tax. So this is seeking voter authorization to levy a tax on the purchases of goods and services sold in Jefferson County. These can be broad, so just a broad sales tax that applies to all goods and services sold in a jurisdiction, or include exemptions. So the sales tax is not levied on specified categories of goods and services, like groceries or medical supplies, are fairly common exemptions. Sales tax related measures were the most common and broadly successful category of revenue raising measure among comparable counties. So of the 68 revenue raising measures presented to voters in comparable counties that we reviewed, 34 were sales tax related. I think a caveat here is that most of the counties we looked at already passed a broad revenue retention measure quite a while ago. So it would make sense that that's not a potential solution that comes up a lot in counties that have already done that, since there's no need to go back and ask for something that already exists. So just want to add that caveat there in terms of the frequency with which these appeared. And then of the 18 measures, 18 of these measures were sales tax increases, and 14 of which were approved by voters. And all 18 of them, as tax increases, of course, carry the Tabor mandated ballot language beginning with shall taxes be increased by, and then the total amount. And another note here is that all 14 sales tax increase measures approved by voters in comparable counties appeared on the ballot during higher turnout even year elections. And conversely, 3 of the 4 measures that were rejected appeared on the ballot during low turnout odd year elections. Oh, yes.
Does that sales tax, is it just unincorporated Jefferson County, or is it all Jefferson County?
Well, this isn't a specific proposal for Jefferson County. This is just talking about.
But I mean, if the county had one, would it be all of Jefferson County or just unincorporated areas for the sales tax?
That would depend on the ballot language of what was referred.
Do either?
I believe it's possible to do either.
But are you asking, do we know that question for these sales tax items too? Do we know if they were unincorporated or if they were across the board?
I believe the ones we looked at were across the board. But
Cities and unincorporated.
yeah, so the countywide. So this was for this analysis, and we're happy to share the report that has all of the different election results that we looked at. This was countywide measures, so not limited to unincorporated or not limited to select municipalities.
Thank you.
All right, the next one here is property taxes. So this is seeking voter authorization to increase the mill levy for some or all properties. Comparable counties made very few efforts to present property tax related measures for voter consideration in the past decade. So of the 68 revenue raising measures presented to voters in comparable counties that we reviewed for this report, just 5 were related to property taxes. 4 of those measures called for countywide property tax increases, and every single one was rejected by voters in both high turnout, even year elections, and low turnout odd year elections alike. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in report. Just based on numerous factors, including the findings of the community outreach phase, we do not recommend considering additional property taxes as a potential solution to the county's funding challenges at this time, in this political environment, and there's just a lot of debate and uncertainty surrounding property taxes right now. So just wanted to make that clear up front that, every so often counties for county level, countywide revenue questions have tried this. It has not been particularly successful. And generally speaking, we mostly saw these property tax increases for more discrete functions referred by school districts or library districts, jurisdictions like that. Jump to the next slide. A few other key takeaways from this review of other ballot measures, which is that election years matter. So voters in both Jefferson County and comparable counties were more likely to approve county level revenue raising measures in high turnout even year elections than low turnout odd year elections. And paper mandated ballot language is not necessarily a deal breaker. So both in Jefferson County and comparable counties, there were a wide range of county level and statewide measures that carried ballot language beginning with the shall taxes and or debt be increased by. And this wasn't necessarily a deal breaker. Many measures with this language passed, many failed. It more comes down to, do voters get a clear sense of what the funds would be spent on, and is that something that they would feel is worth the trade-off? And then another thing that we observe is voters are more supportive of ballot measures that get to the point clearly and quickly. So we invented a little political science term here that we've called distance to how. If anyone here was a political science major and has a better idea for a name for that term, we welcome the suggestions. But it's a term that we define as the character count, excluding spaces between the beginning of a measure's ballot language and the first measure of how new revenue would be spent. So generally speaking, it appears that voters in both Jefferson County and comparable counties were more likely to approve county level revenue raising measures with a distance to how of 400 characters or less. And again, this is something that I think intuitively should not be terribly surprising. People are not excited to vote for things if it's not clear what that thing would do. And so the more quickly and clearly it can be made apparent the decision voters are being asked to make, that, correlates to approval. Although again, it's not a guarantee. There are several examples of revenue raising measures that get to the point very quickly and were still rejected. So, voters obviously also have to feel that, how the funds would be used aligns with their priorities and is worth the trade-off of whatever the revenue raising measure is asking. Jump to the next slide here. And then there's just a very top level overview for reference for folks. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but this is just the Jeffco measures 2012 to present that we looked at specifically. So I just want to have this in here as a reference for folks, and we have similar results for the other counties as well. If people are interested in that, I'm happy to follow up with that report for people. If we could jump to the next slide here. Just a few other key takeaways in terms of what's been tried before. So one thing, because I think one thing we want to caution against is, using we've tried certain things in the past and it wasn't approved, therefore we should completely take this off the table. I want to caution against that just because of the specifics of what Jefferson County voters have actually been asked to consider since 2012. And caution against that being the sole deciding factor one way or another, which is that, first of all, voters have not been presented with a revenue retention option that, in our view, clearly specifies how new funds would be spent. So you have 2012 question 1A, it did not specify a funding destination, but still only lost narrowly in spite of this. 2029 question 1A, it required voters to sift through more than 1,100 characters of, in our subjective opinion, extremely confusing ballot language before specifying a funding destination, and it lost quite badly by almost 10 points. So, even though 2022 didn't specify a funding destination, just by virtue of being more comprehensible, it came within a point of passage. So this is just to say that, a revenue retention measure with clear language that clearly specifies how new funds would be spent is not something that's really been tried in the past decade plus. And then voters have also had limited opportunities to consider county level sales taxes. So 2022 question 1C was tied to 1B, which would involve legalization in unincorporated Jefferson County. It would have generated very limited revenue, and it had a vaguely defined funding destination. The funding destination specified was public safety operations determined by the Board of County Commissioners. As we'll get into in later phases, voters generally prefer to see more specificity, as much specificity as possible, while keeping the balance with keeping ballot language clear and to the point, which are contradictory things that need to be kept in balance. And then 2016 question 4B was an extension of an existing sales tax for Jefferson County's portion of the Denver Metro SCFD. That was overwhelmingly approved, and that's, not really a great example to make big decisions on one way or another either. It's kind of a unique extension of something that is a Jeffco portion of a broader special district. And then voters have also approved mill levy increases for education and library funding. And really one small notable thing here is that voters rejected mill and bond, and oh boy, that's covered by something at the bottom. My notes here. I believe it was in 2016, there was a mill and bond package that was rejected, and the exact same package was approved when asked again in 2018. So I think this is just to say that referring something and having it rejected does not necessarily guarantee that it will do worse in the future. By a similar token, 2019 question 1A, that was a revenue retention measure that lost quite badly, but that did not appear to drag down 2022 question 1A, which carried more clear language and improved. So, the results don't necessarily carry over from one year to the other. Could jump to the next. Very quick overview of the county's financial needs, and you'll have already gotten a much more detailed overview of this from the SPA presentation proceeding, but these are just some of the different line item costs of the county's funding challenges. And there's a heavily simplified version of this. I should qualify. I'm sure SPA can give a much more detailed analysis of this. Basically, resolving the structural imbalance for the general fund deficit, estimated annual cost of 15 to 20 million. An additional 20 million is what would be required to freeze the infrastructure backlog that's been growing. And then from there, we also have a few different price points for reducing the infrastructure backlog and the estimated time it would take to do so. And again, this is all pretty heavily simplified for the purposes of this presentation. Definitely encourage folks to follow up with the SPA for more detail on these numbers. To the next slide. To address the county's funding challenges, looking at potential ballot solutions, we started with a much broader universe of potential options than this. And over the course of this project, used through the community outreach phase, we've really narrowed it down to a short list of potential revenue solutions. So here we have a revenue retention measure for all revenues with no sunset, where the county would seek approval to retain excess revenue from existing tax rates. It would exempt all revenues without a time limit, but the use of these newly retained funds could be limited to specific county departments or programs, depending on the final ballot language. That would be estimated to generate 54.4 million in annual revenues, and then a half-cent sales tax with exemptions for food, medical supplies, and diapers. Sales tax of 50 cents on a $100 purchase. Would be estimated to generate a bit more revenue at 68.4 million. Up to the next slide here. So I'm going to do a very, very quick overview of our community outreach phase here. So there were 3 different components of this. The first was surveys and interviews with leadership and staff of county offices and departments. Spoke to a lot of the people in this room as part of this process. We also did surveys and interviews with community leaders from a wide variety of backgrounds, including members of county boards and commissions, elected officials representing municipalities throughout the county, and individuals and organizations who are actively involved in county civic life or serve county residents. And then there were also 3 phases of public opinion surveys from a representative sample of Jefferson County residents. So there was a qualitative forum discussion with 31 county residents from a diverse range of backgrounds in March of 2024, and then 2 separate quantitative public opinion surveys of 1,800 randomly selected county residents. So that was 800 people surveyed in the first quantitative instrument and 1,000 people surveyed in the second quantitative instrument. And those were conducted in March and April of 2024. So just a quick overview of the county leaders' feedback. 16 offices and department leaders submitted survey responses and 12% participated in follow-up interviews. We covered subjects like each department's day-to-day work and how it could be or has already been impacted by the county's funding challenges, each leader's experience with the county's past attempts to refer ballot questions, and suggestions for how the county should approach any future ballot questions if it ultimately decides to refer one or more to Jeffco voters in 2024. And I'm going to give a very Cliff Notes overview of this. So, if you participated in this process and you don't see your exact feedback reflected here, my apologies. We try to consolidate this as much as possible while still accurately summarizing the feedback we received. So key takeaway one was just limited awareness of the workings of county government. Not everybody is as extra cool as the folks in this room who are very engaged in the day-to-day functioning of state and local government in Colorado. So a lot of folks expressed that there's just limited awareness of what the county does every day, the services it provides, including services that are mandatory and legally required, their associated costs, as well as past cost-cutting measures. It's worth noting, as we talk about these funding challenges, that the county has already made roughly $25 million in general fund cuts since 2020. Doesn't seem to be a lot of public awareness of that. Two is staffing challenges. A lot of county leaders mentioned lack of wage competitiveness and salary stagnation as having major impacts on staff retention. County staff are spread increasingly thin and being asked to do more with less, which has all sorts of trickle-down impacts. Leaders also noted rising costs affecting every facet of county operations. And growth challenges. The county's funding challenges are preventing the county services from keeping up with the needs of a growing community. New neighborhoods and subdivisions are being built faster than county resources can keep up. And a lot of departments are still being impacted by prior budget cuts while their volume of work for service requests is increasing. We heard some particularly stark examples from people engaged in public safety work. One that stands out to me is that the sheriff's office has as many deputies on patrol today as it did 20 years ago, even though the county has grown substantially in that time. And the district attorney's office is functioning with much, much fewer staff and resources than offices in comparably sized counties. We could jump to the next slide here. Another big takeaway is that if revenue is not increased, public services will suffer in a variety of ways. The county could experience higher staff turnover and decreased morale, increased potential for mistakes due to reduced training budgets, longer wait time for public services, potential forfeiture of federal grant dollars. And from some county departments, we talked to state grant dollars as well. A lot of those require matching funds. A lot of those matching funds come from general fund dollars that would potentially be cut if new revenue isn't identified. An increased backlog of preventative maintenance and repairs, which of course makes things more expensive in the long term, and then potentially higher costs and a risk to the community due to services. And then if revenue was increased, leaders suggested focusing on staffing, technology improvements, and prioritizing various programs and services throughout the county, like transportation, public safety, and services. And then feedback we got on potential solutions varied. Some respondents recommended that the county explore additional cost reduction measures, centralization and consolidation of certain services, analyzing county-owned properties, and reducing travel spending. And then other potential solutions aligned a lot with what we've seen in other counties in terms of recommendations we heard from county leaders. So seeking approval for revenue retention, seeking voter approval for sales tax. Some of the selling points for a sales tax being that it helps share costs with visitors to the county, but also allows for a variety of exemptions to minimize the impact on common purchases by residents. A few other ideas involved special districts and fees and services. Also a pretty strong consensus of avoiding seeking voter approval for property tax increases given the ongoing debate and uncertainty in current political environment regarding property taxes throughout Colorado. County leaders also pretty overwhelmingly emphasized the importance of clear and direct communications, helping with public education and articulating the difference between distinct entities like the county and the school district and the state. And ensuring that if the county does choose to refer a potential ballot solution, that the language is clear, concise, and plainly states what new revenues would be used for. And then I'm going to do a quick overview of the stakeholder outreach here, and then I'll hand it over to Alex to discuss the public opinion surveys. So we also conducted surveys and interviews of community leaders from a wide variety of backgrounds. All in all, we sent invitations to provide feedback to 284 community leaders and stakeholders. We received 65 responses, and the subjects we covered included respondents' day-to-day experience with county services, how their life and work would be impacted or could be impacted by the county's funding challenges, and then their experience with past funding questions, as well as their suggestions for how the county should approach any potential solutions to funding challenges in the future. And also try to keep this open-ended, encourage people to share both positive and negative perceptions of the county's work and services, as well as positive and negative perceptions of the past funding ballot questions that Jeffco residents have been presented with. Get to the next slide here. So we got responses from people from a wide range of background, chambers of commerce, policy advocates, state representatives, special districts and fire district employees. So we have a full list of all the responses available in an additional report if anyone's interested in diving in depth. Respondents said that the county impacts their daily work and life in order of frequency, really mentioning roads and road maintenance, and then homelessness, human services and housing, as well as sheriff, public safety, jail and court services were the big top three. In terms of what respondents felt could be improved from the county, just coordination and availability of services. One thing that we saw a lot was just a general frustration with lack of resources for homelessness, and not just with the county, but a lot of people expressing the sentiment of we don't know where to go, we don't know where to send people. Also lots of road and bridge maintenance and response times. Also talking a lot of mention of processing times for things like planning and zoning, as well as just enforcement of existing county policy. And then in terms of services that respondents cited as high quality, library, open space, sheriff and the courts, and roads were all at the top of the list, and there were a few other mentioned as well, but the ones bolded were the ones that were mentioned most frequently. And then in terms of county services that respondents would least like to see cut, or felt should be prioritized for additional funding if additional revenue is identified, approved, housing, homelessness, and human services. In general, the issue of housing came up a lot throughout this community outreach process, as well as the sheriff and public safety, and roads, maintenance, plowing, infrastructure projects, and paving. Lots of mention of filling potholes and improving roads and things like that. And then in terms of past funding measures, we got a lot of feedback from people who both opposed, supported, or were just unsure about past measures, either couldn't recall how they voted or chose not to vote on past measures. And this is the 2019 and 2022 revenue retention questions. So, from folks who opposed them, they felt that taxes are high enough already, and the county has a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and also generally just expressed support for Tabor. But again, this is where you see the perception that revenue retention is somehow in opposition to Tabor, which I would politely disagree with. It's part of Tabor. Asking voters for approval is a core tenet of Tabor, but that is a perception a lot of folks have. In terms of feedback from respondents who supported the past measures, we did get a lot of feedback that the language of past measures was convoluted, unclear, just didn't provide people with enough information to make an informed choice. A lot of folks who supported past measures said they would also support alternative funding mechanisms like a sales tax. We got some sentiment that a measure would not pass in a presidential year, which again, I'll politely disagree with. I don't think our review of the data shows that, but that is a point of feedback that we got. And in the interest of transparency, we did want to pass that along. And then feedback from respondents who were unsure about past measures. There's a very common sentiment, which is a lot of confusion as to how revenues can be down when residential and commercial property values have been increased. There has been a year plus of local media coverage talking about a property tax explosion. So how could there possibly be a need for more funding? And again, this is where there's a lot of room for public education because of just the complexities of how the county functions. I believe it's 76% of property tax revenues collected by the county are collected for other governments, like the school district, municipalities, and then special districts like fire and water districts. So the county is not keeping the vast majority of the property tax revenue it collects in terms of the answer to this question. And then, again, because Jeffco is in a fairly exclusive club of 2 counties that doesn't have a revenue retention measure that applies broadly to total revenues, it really doesn't matter how much property tax revenue is collected because everything past the limit is not funds that the county can keep. Jump next slide here. And then, so this is some recommendations from respondents in terms of potential solutions to community funding, county funding challenges. We want to make it extremely clear that this is a summary of ideas submitted by the community. These are not our suggestions. These are not aspect suggestions. These are not ideas that the county leadership or staff have been bringing up. This is all purely solicited from the community. Again, we see a lot of talk about the clarity of ballot language and, making it clear to voters what choice they're being asked to make. A lot of emphasis on tying funding requests to, what specifically will this money be used for in as much detail as is possible, while being held in balance with keeping the ballot language clear and comprehensible. Also, a lot of suggestions for readjusting funding priorities, calls for more public education, and then a bunch of different suggestions. So we have people saying raise property taxes. We have people saying don't raise property taxes. We have people, all politeness and due respect, suggesting things that are not advisable or legally possible, such as removing Tabor, which I think wildly overestimates the power of county government. And then, a lot of thoughts about messaging, not using fear mongering, keeping messaging positive, things of that nature. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Alex to talk about our public opinion research findings. So these are some of the research questions that we were aiming to answer throughout this process, and I will hand it off to Alex from here.
Alex, before we get started, just realizing the time, we're likely going to go past 11 o'clock. So if you are able to stay, I would encourage you to stay. Just acknowledging that I know this next section is really important and there's a lot of details, but it's valuable to get your feedback as well. So those that can stay, please do.
Yeah, I will just reinforce that if there's a way we could really perhaps zero in on the headlines that came out of the polling, because this will be our only opportunity as a board to hear feedback from folks around the table.
This is the only opportunity.
We're going to have another conversation on Tuesday. It's not, Alexis, it's not the only opportunity, but it's a really critical one. That's all I'm saying.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah,
I guess my
that's what
concern
I'm-
is being read about the PowerPoint, so I would really like to just hear, the highlights and then your thoughts, given your level of experience of what you're bringing to the table.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's exactly perfect.
I will do my best for those that need to leave at 11 to cover as much as I possibly can, recognizing that this was a 4-month process, 3 phases of public opinion research with a lot of residents. So as a quick overview, we conducted, like I said, 3 phases. The first was qualitative in nature. So we took a small group of residents that were recruited to be representative of the overall county demographics. We spent 3 days asking them open-ended questions about their feelings around county quality of life, priorities for funding, how they thought the county government worked, needs and priorities and vision for the future. The second phase was a policy study that was a quantitative survey. It was a sort of non-traditional design in that it was really designed to explore optimization of a number of potential elements that could eventually constitute a ballot title. The third phase was an outreach poll that was much more like a traditional poll that many of you, I'm sure, have seen, in which we built on the first two phases in order to do viability testing of potential revenue options for the county. There's some methodological notes on this slide. Please familiarize yourselves with those. I'm happy to answer questions, but in the interest of time, let's just keep skipping ahead. So we're going to present this in the following format. We're going to ask some questions, we're going to provide answers, and then support those with data. So I think, Jeannie, we'll just skip these transitional slides with the Q&A and just go right to the thank you. That's perfect. So quality of life in Jeffco, something that most people feel is headed in the right direction. There's a lot of things that underpin their feelings about that. For a lot of people, they think of the open space, they think of the quality of the roads, they think of the accessibility to the mountains, and everything that comes with a sort of quintessential Jeffco life. On the next slide, you can see some of the big concerns that were raised in phase one when respondents had a chance to express these concerns and questions in their own words. Really fell into four buckets: housing, especially around affordability and supply; roads, around road conditions, around deterioration, around capacity; public safety. Most people that were focused on public safety cited issues around feeling safe in their neighborhoods, crime, in some cases homelessness, and then public transit, just getting around the county in the most effective way possible. Next slide, please. There was also a general perception that the county is doing a good to fair job of serving its residents. Now, this comes with a huge asterisk that most people don't understand the core functions of the county in the first place. So there were not strong opinions on this front, as you can see, but generally speaking, people did not identify massive gaps in infrastructure or services that they felt like were failing them. Next slide, please. And then let's just skip on to the next one. So in terms of funding, and this is going to come from the phase 3 survey, before we got into any specific revenue solutions, we asked, generally speaking, do you think the county has enough funding, or does it need additional funding in order to accomplish its objectives? And folks were really divided on this question. There was a little bit more intensity, as you can see, on the side of folks who said they probably have enough. But there was also, as we learned in phase 1, not a clear sense of really what goes into the county budget, what that's being used for, and specifically what future needs look like. Next slide, please. There was also a question we asked that is really core, I think, to all of the bigger questions that you all are considering, which was, generally speaking, without identifying a specific revenue solution, would you support or oppose increasing taxes in Jeffco to fund programs like transportation, public safety, and infrastructure? And this is where the divisions really become apparent. You can see the county is divided right down the middle without really learning any more about what that funding increase would look like or what specifically would be funded. In concept, there is some real conflict right now with a lot of folks concerned around their cost of living and what that would mean for their own personal bottom line. Next slide. So there's a few things that go into this. The first is the information gap that I just shared with you. Folks just don't really know what the county needs and what it has. The second is that folks describe in pretty glaring terms their struggles right now with economic conditions. On the left side, you can see a plurality of county residents say they just get by but struggle to save money or pay for unexpected expenses. Another 13% say it's difficult just for them to make ends meet each month. There's really only less than 40% who are able to live comfortably and save right now. Some of the highest numbers we've seen, this isn't unique to Jeffco. We're seeing this across Colorado in this economic environment. We've been seeing it for the last year to year and a half, but it's just the moment that people are living in right now. And you can see there's a clear correlation between people's self-described or economic circumstances and their willingness to support revenue on the right side. So the folks who are the most hard pressed in their own personal circumstances are the ones who are most likely to oppose a revenue increase. Next slide. So we looked at specific funding priorities that might be addressed by a revenue solution. And this is the tier 1 out of the full list. We'll show you the next slide with the rest of those priorities in just a second. That question we asked is, would you be more or less likely to support a measure if it supported the following county programs and services? And for reasons so essentially, you're looking at, in green is the folks who say they're more likely to support those programs. In black is the folks who say they would be less likely to support a revenue measure if it included those specific uses. So transportation clearly highlighted at the top, fixing potholes, road and bridge repair. You also see a constellation of other uses underneath that. Everything from youth mental and behavioral health programs to wildfire mitigation, child nutrition, addiction and mental health programs. All these fall under that tier 1 scope. On the next slide, you can see the continuation of some of these funding uses. Now, many of these still fall above that 50% mark in terms of attracting a majority of county residents who say they would support more than they would oppose that particular funding source. Everything from crime prevention to home health for infants and new mothers. As we get further down the list, we start to get into more divided territory. So things like homelessness response, the sheriff's office, the district attorney's office, falling farther down that list. Now, again, this is an ask that is specific to would you support additional revenue? It's not any sort of ask about a referendum on these different programs and services or popularity of those programs or those departments. Next slide shows what we asked in phase 2, which was a further validation of some of these findings. So slightly different results format, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of this, but suffice to say that public safety in a holistic sense, in other words, wildfire mitigation, flood response, addiction and mental health programs, a lot of the things we just talked about, really came out on top alongside transportation and infrastructure in terms of the things that people said they would be willing to increase their taxes to fund. We also saw a pretty positive response to child and family services. Where we started to see it tail off was public safety, specifically with respect to sheriff, district attorney, and other county public safety functions. Next slide, please.
Alex, as you're going through this, can you underscore or emphasize the programs versus offices?
So what's an exchange versus the offices? That's not a reflection on the sheriff or.
Of course, so we can provide it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Don't want to hang out with us, and then I don't want people. It's a bad thing if they are hanging out with us.
My theory on the district attorney number, for what it's worth, and this is just a theory, is that people see attorney who works for the government are not fully connecting.
Oh, maybe they just.
DA's office stuff.
They don't hang out with me either, I just search stuff. We can provide a really concrete example of what this looks like in terms of crime prevention programs versus sheriff and district attorney offices, right? So people are clearly more readily available and willing to support things that actually have an on-the-ground impact in their communities that they feel like are tangible uses of taxpayer dollars. Sometimes when we're talking about those broader agencies and offices, it's less clear exactly what that impact would be. So there's a lot that goes into this. Obviously we didn't get open-ended responses on these questions, but I think we can sort of impute from them some of the things that people were reacting to when they made those value judgments.
And I think a lot of it comes down to specificity as well. That is something that we kind of found reviewing the ballot measure results from comparable counties, as well as the past decade plus in Jeffco, is that the more specificity there is about what funds would be used for, the more comfortable the public is in supporting them. And so I think it speaks more to what specifically would the sheriff and district attorney be doing. People want that spelled out in more detail. And I think that also kind of aligns with, something we heard about in phase 1, which is a resistance to anything that is perceived as too open-ended or perceived as a blank check. I think the public, understandably wants to know in more detail what funding would be used for.
Next slide. Let's keep going to the next one. Thank you. In phase 2, this was the beginning of our look at what might, when you think of a long list of ingredients that might go into a ballot measure soup, what would those different elements look like in a combined fashion in order to address the needs and priorities of residents. And so we tested a wide range of different options, including 2 different versions of the sales tax, the 0.5% version, 0.75% version, as well as 2 different slight variations on revenue retention measures and a wide range of funding destinations. We also tested things like a sunset, different accountability measures, and exemptions on the sales tax options. The next slide shows you where we landed in phase 2. Again, this is a little bit of a different style of approach in terms of data collection, but what to take away from this slide is simply that what we found is that those revenue retention measures garnered more support across the electorate here in Jefferson County as compared to tax increases, specifically those sales tax measures. But of course, there's also a difference between the sales taxes themselves, with people expressing a little bit more willingness to support the 0.5% level as compared to the larger amount. Next slide shows you moving on to phase 3 and sort of bundling up all the learnings we got from phase 1 and 2, the ballot titles that we eventually tested in our viability study. So the first option was revenue retention. It was focused specifically on public safety and child and family services. Option 2 was a sales tax solely devoted to transportation. Option 3 was a sales tax devoted to both transportation and public safety. The next slide shows you how folks really responded to those. So the colored bars are support, the black bars are opposition. What we found is that roughly 56% supported a revenue retention measure under these conditions. 45% supported a sales tax exclusively devoted to transportation, whereas adding both transportation and public safety increased their appetite for a sales tax to 51%. But one thing that you'll notice, and I'll highlight this on the next slide, is that, if you could skip ahead, thanks. I know these are kind of rapid fire, I apologize. The intensity behind the residents' views on these different measures closely match what you saw in prior slides in terms of a larger cohort of residents strongly opposing these measures than strongly supporting them. That's always a red flag for us as we look at building out bases of support and opposition and how that might play out over the course of a campaign if something like this were to be referred to the ballot.
So ideally, would you want to see that bottom statistic, the percentage to be the same? Knowing that people lean and that's just the way life is.
Yeah, of course. That's a good point. So I think typically what we want to see more than just an equalization is actually getting as close as possible between the folks who characterize themselves either as definitely supportive or as probably supportive to that 50% threshold. Because then you have, once you defeat leaners, then you're much closer to the so-called win number.
Knowing how many unaffiliated are in Jeffco, with it being 30% and that they lean, does that change how you evaluate what Jeffco would do in this, or is it?
Statewide, the number of unaffiliated is over 50% now. So, we don't necessarily find those folks to be more likely to be leaners on a question like this as compared to people who describe themselves in a partisan context.
Okay, that's very helpful to understand.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I have a question. I'm sorry. So revenue retention, you didn't test transportation and infrastructure for revenue retention. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so there were a number of different reasons. The first is because we had 1,000 folks to talk to, and we had to make some decisions about moving forward with just a couple of options. So the first thing was we couldn't test endless permutations of these different options. The second was we did feel like we needed to test them in ways in which the county would be able to spend them. And there are some rules around how that would be governed. I'm certainly not qualified to speak to some of the legal ramifications here, but that was another component. And we also felt that the revenue retention measure would make it harder for the county ultimately to solve the transportation backlog issues given the size of those. So what we did when we formulated the transportation focused revenue retention measure alongside the sales tax measure is we tested those in tandem. So there was a scenario in which we could understand if the county wanted to refer two separate measures, one would be dedicated specifically to transportation, the other would be dedicated to public safety and child and family services.
And just to elaborate slightly on that last point, the amount of revenue that would be generated by the revenue retention measure is another big factor here, because there are really two large financial needs facing the county. The first, general fund deficit. The second is the transportation infrastructure backlog. So the revenue retention measure generates a little less revenue than sales tax measure. And so a revenue retention measure, you would need a large portion of that new revenue to address the general fund deficit. And then there would be another portion that could at least freeze the growth of the transportation backlog. But it's difficult to imagine a revenue retention option generating enough revenue to make, actual progress on reducing the size of the backlog. So for something like that, we felt you would need a sales tax, which generates a larger amount of revenue.
When the county did the 2019 effort, was there polling done at that? Was this similar study done prior to launching of the 1A and
Say that one more time.
was there a similar effort made to evaluate the electorate in
Yes,
in 2019?
there was an intent poll that we
Okay,
did.
and
Yes.
do we have any comparisons that are valuable here, or is that not worth looking at? Have you all seen it?
We have not, but my understanding is that the ballot title of the 2019 measure was changed significantly in the hearing in which it was referred. So the polling wouldn't really be, the polling wouldn't really apply to that because
Enough said.
the language of the ballot title changed significantly after the poll was conducted.
I think, the sheriff has a question.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So if I'm hearing you right, you had just stated that you didn't want to put the transportation under revenue because you didn't want to state it twice under revenue and then under sales tax, but yet it's stated twice under sales tax. So my question is this, since this is phase 3 and you were using the data from the first two phases, what is the logic used behind putting transportation and public safety together and not separating public safety out for one of the questions? What was the logic behind that?
I believe this is a situation where the sales tax is the only thing that would be referred. So a scenario where only one question is referred, having it limited to just public safety would really restrict the county's flexibility to make progress on the transportation backlog. And so I think that's kind of one of the main reasons for having 2 in 1, because there was a situation as well where it was the county sends 2 questions. So there's a revenue retention measure that is specified public safety and child and family services, which is primarily for the general fund deficit, and then a second question for just transportation. But there would also maybe one of the scenarios we considered was referring just one sales tax measure. And in that situation, we wanted to make sure that there were funding destinations specified to address both of the county's large financial challenges.
I guess what I'm asking is not the I thinks or the I believes. What I'm asking is, based on the first 2 polls that went out, what precisely and definitively is the logic used in putting transportation and public safety together? Based on what you already had learned.
That is the logic. In a scenario where you're sending only one sales tax, the county would need flexibility because by specifying a
But
funding destination.
you did it with just transportation here.
And with just transportation though, that would be paired with a second question. So there isn't really a scenario where we would say, send only one question and it's only a sales tax and it only funds transportation, because that's leaving the issue of the general fund deficit unaddressed. So in the question where it was transportation only sales tax, that would be in a situation where the county would be referring 2 questions. A sales tax devoted to transportation and then a revenue retention measure devoted to public safety and child and family services, which helps address the general fund deficit.
We did,
And Alex, I don't know if there's anything you
Question
want to add. No, I think that was perfect. Please.
I have a quick question. One of the challenges that we saw in the results is that neither debrucing nor sales tax reached our 60% or higher threshold, which is concerning to me. And when you disaggregate the data at 51% and 56% sales tax and debruce, you still have leaning in. You don't have strong, solid support. What I thought was interesting is that you had mentioned earlier that 14 of the comparable counties that had, of the 18, passed their sales tax increase. Can you talk to us more about why you think we saw what we saw in terms of the sales tax? And would there, I'm going to just throw this out. I'm not suggesting we do this, but I do want to throw this out as a question. If we were to look at the timing of circling back and doing another poll with our community on the sales tax related to safety and some of the components we know, again, focused on services and programs as opposed to offices, of course, what would that timeline look like? Could we do something quickly like that? So 2 questions. Any reason, any thoughts on why Jeffco came out so low compared to other counties that actually passed a sales tax? And then would there be time to do another poll on that to retest it?
and I just want to note really quick, it's a little after 11, so if anybody needs to leave.
I'll leave at 11:15. I got 11:30.
Okay.
Okay. So we have a couple of slides actually that I'd like to show really quickly that speak directly to your point, Commissioner. So if we could just advance a couple ahead, maybe 3 or 4 more. One more. Yep, there we go. So this slide is, I think, illustrative in that it shows the differences between revenue retention and a sales tax option based on people's economic circumstances. And this was really one of the core dividing lines. Folks who were economically stressed, they were more likely to support a revenue retention measure, but they really fell off when we started talking about a sales tax increase. And we've seen this in countless different jurisdictions across the Front Range and Colorado, where an extension of an existing tax or something like a revenue retention measure is something that people approach with a more open mind in this current economic environment than something that raises their taxes. They're still really scarred from the property tax increases statewide, along with inflation, cost of living, all the other things that go into that. So I think this is a core reason for why there is a difference there. And honestly, I was a little surprised the difference wasn't greater between the two because revenue retention doesn't require that tax increase. So that would be sort of my answer. Hopefully that makes sense and that answers your question.
If I could speak to the past years as well, I think it's important to note the difference in how voters, not just in Jefferson County, but throughout Colorado feel about their economic circumstances in this current environment relative to some of those past years when those other sales taxes were approved. So I just wanted to make sure I put a fine point on that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great contextual point.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to answer the second part and then I'll come right back to you. The second part is, I guess it's a little bit hard to talk in concrete terms because it would depend on a lot of different factors, like how much went into that instrument, if it was just a really quick test of something, or if we felt we needed to do a more comprehensive approach. Assuming it was just quick and dirty, so to speak, it would probably be a matter of weeks, not months. But we could talk about those specifics if there was interest on the county's behalf.
I'm hoping that by the end we'll talk a little bit about what you think communications can and cannot do.
Okay, and we are coming to a close. So I think we can go to the next section. So we did simulate that sort of community dialogue, right, with communications, and we tested a number of different statements, both pro and con. We rotated these so that some respondents heard the pro statements first, other respondents heard the con statements first, then we checked back in on the different measures that we were considering. And these statements that you see in front of you, I know the text is extremely small, but if you don't have a microscope in front of you, hopefully you have a packet. Just a note about those, we developed those sort of initially in phase 1 based on what we were hearing from people in an open-ended sense. and then refine those over the course of the research. So the next slide shows you how folks responded to those. We use a convincing scale for whether or not this resonates with our county residents as a reason to support a tax funding measure for Jefferson County. What you tend to see here is that these statements, we typically use about a 40% threshold for a very convincing score to indicate that it's really resonating outside just sort of a smaller core base of residents. So these have some breadth of appeal, but in terms of intensity, they're struggling to get over that basic hump of people feeling like they're overstretched. And so our read on this situation is less that folks aren't aligned with county needs and priorities and future vision for the county as it manifests in terms of roads, public safety, and some of the other thematic categories that we explored, but more that it's still struggling to rise to the level of motivating them to change their mind on a tax increase. The next slide shows you the con statements that we tested. We tested an equal number on both sides, everything from bureaucracy to this just being the wrong time for a measure like this to removing Tabor refunds, everything that you might expect to hear. And so the next slide shows you the responses to those. And the first thing you'll notice here, we use the same convincing scale, is that overall, these are more convincing messages at this moment in time. So they tend to have both more intensity and more breadth of appeal to residents. There's a lot of folks who are cross-pressured. They're in the middle and they say, some of the positives appeal to me and some of the negatives appeal to me. So this isn't just a black and white cut and dried situation, but this is kind of the mix right now. The next slide should show you what happens when we simulate that community dialogue and then go back and check in on the revenue measures that we initially tested. So for each color of bars on the left side, you see the initial stance among respondents. And then on the right side, you see the final stance after that simulation of the discussion. And each one does lose some support. Opposition increases in some of those cases, not in all, but they do all lose at least some degree of support, and they all end up at or below 50% on the final test. The last thing I think I would mention is something that, given our time constraints, I think we should probably just skip, but I'll just say one thing about it. Our scope for this research was not just to assess openness to revenue. It was also to assess how staff, leadership, and others at the county can communicate with their residents about these challenges, irrespective of whether the county pursues a funding measure. So we did learn a lot about that, and we were able to connect residents' values with a lot of county needs in ways that we think can hopefully make the county's job easier, and just having that broader conversation around where the county is, connecting that to residents day to day. So I'll stop there. I know we're already over time. Yeah, please.
Do you have any stats on the people that you did surveys? Like,
Sure. Do you have specific?
people? Like,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, maybe age or
Yeah, I
maybe
can.
political connection or.
I can provide all of that to you if you'd like, so you can peruse it, but just to say that it's all representative based on census statistics and voter file data, which are kind of our gold standard sources for that. So, and it's a survey of registered voters, which is pretty expansive across the county. It's not just narrow to likely voters or anything like that.
Okay. It's good to hear.
Please.
I don't know if we're gonna be able to meet again as a group, but in the beginning, it talked about the 2022 ballot question 1A, which was a retention. And I talked about retaining funds from state grants, interest earned, and a few other things. That only failed by 3,000 votes, and there was no campaign for that ballot question whatsoever. I still think that ballot question is viable for 2024 in a general election. Now, I also think a public safety ballot question and the public or road and bridge ballot question are viable if they define what they're spending the money on. And I think the voters want specificity of what they're voting on. You know, we're gonna fix these roads and public safety, or they're gonna buy vehicles or whatever they're gonna do, or guns. So, I think that's where, I see still, you know, I'm not Joe Namath, I can't guarantee a win here, but I think 3 questions, one on public safety, one on road and bridge, and one on the general retention of money, still have a chance to pass with this year, especially on the way things are going nationally and everything else.
Can I ask whether you tested revenue retention, taking out the references to sheriff and the DA? Because I wondered why in the language, when we saw that the brand resonance for sheriff and district attorney was so low, why we put them in there and those other things were polling so much more favorably, I guess, from a thematic standpoint. So did we test that, or what do you think would happen if we just took out any references to departments and kept it a little more vague?
Do you want us to start? Yeah, I can start, and why don't you jump in? So it's a great question, and we made, this was a window into many discussions that we had amongst county staff, amongst Bighorn and ourselves. And ultimately, we decided that we felt that revenue retention was something that would need to cover a lot of different funding needs for the county. And in order to give the county as much flexibility as possible in addressing those needs, you know, it's difficult when you have a ballot title, because if something isn't specified clearly in the funding uses in that title, then there can be restrictions around how that money is spent or whether it can be spent for those purposes. And because there are significant amounts of funding needs among both sheriff and district attorney offices, we felt like we wanted to make sure that the county had the flexibility it needed to make those decisions and that discretion. We also felt like we tried to clearly identify as many programs and service areas that really connected with residents as well.
Yeah.
So we really tried to make this as you know, something that would be that would feel like it was on par with folks' priorities, but also give the county the discretion that it needed to use the funds in the way that made the most sense, especially as revenue needs change over time.
Yeah, get that. And I just, since we're in this forum, thinking through the connection, I'm looking up here as if there's anything up there, the connection between those programs listed or those services are not housed, they're not all housed in the sheriff and DA. And I wonder, it's like, I immediately thought, why didn't we say Health and Human Services, which are 2 departments that are, you know, also, of course, perpetually underfunded, who do much of the addiction and mental health and the nutrition and the homelessness. And I'm thinking, then we added sheriff and DA, and I'm like, well, how are those things related? Public safety to people in their minds means law enforcement. It doesn't mean public wellness and like all of those things. So that was a little confusing to me when I saw it, and I wonder what would happen if it was more of the specificity versus the departments. But
I agree with that.
That's something that.
wait, Jerry agreed with me. Is that in the notes?
No, I think you can describe the projects and the programs without saying the DA, the sheriff, human services, say, you know, we're gonna support more cops on the street and whatever, and more people helping homeless. However it word is, you don't tie the ballot question to a person or an elected official or a department that's maybe someone doesn't like. I don't know, whatever it is, but it uses the programs in the description rather than the departments.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Both are great points. And I just want to assure you that in phase 1, we did test a lot of other programs and services and department names. And in our experience, things like human services, health and human services are not well understood by the public. But we tested an extensive list of line items on all these different functions of different agencies and offices to make sure that we were getting a full flavor for what we might consider including. And I think to your point around public safety sometimes meaning one thing to one person and something else to someone else, ultimately, I think we just wanted to make these, to give them some sort of thematic tie-in.
Yeah.
So that folks who just name a ballot title
Right.
can have some way to anchor themselves. And so I agree, it's not perfect. But
I don't expect perfect, I think it was, I'm not feeling that there's a lot of favorable feelings right now towards some of these words, right? If we were just like, everyone's potholes now, and it's like, where's the pothole protection, revenue retention? I mean, then everybody would vote for it, right? So it's, yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. But it will give folks a lot of decisions to make about the way that it's worded, so.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, pothole prevention frees up money
Absolutely.
for other.
Right.
Oh, I'm just said
So-
we're hiring a pothole help.
I'm not offended by it.
No.
Specialist.
Oh.
It's not a popularity contest.
But if they said something like, increased court hours versus, that would, or faster processing of cases in the ballot
Funding
question.
the judges, do you wanna do that?
Well, I want to fund whatever's going to help your department be more efficient and more, user-friendly.
This is along the lines of conversations that could be had if this is something that
Right.
the commissioners ultimately
So-
decide they want to pursue is how, are there alternative phrasings that provide a little more specificity to voters rather than just stating the department name that could be considered, understanding though that that's taking us outside the realm of what has been tested in public opinion research. And, again, we were trying to come up with ballot titles that were as close as possible to what folks might expect to see to try and gain as accurate as insight as possible into how the public feels about these things.
The timeline that we discussed with you all when you first came in, I think was a little earlier than where we currently are. I think originally we discussed a final decision making in June and to be moving forward, and now we're kind of seeping up to that.
Actually,
July.
we've accelerated the timeline a bit by
Okay.
about a month. Originally, it was final decision making sometime in July. So we've
Okay.
actually moved things up about a month
Okay.
earlier than originally planned.
So,
Alright.
Mike, why don't you talk about the next step?
Right.
Okay. At some point though, you all will have to finalize that and move forward into community with community support and does the education piece with adequate funding for a campaign, does an education effort change these numbers significantly? Like what is how big is the factor when it comes to costs?
Well, in terms of what the county would be able to do if something were referred, the county, of course, can't advocate for or against.
No, how about this? I'm asking you just in campaign language only, not in the county. If you are somewhere at, I don't even remember our highest percentage, but it wasn't strong 15.
Mhm.
How much do you all see comms moving that needle? Does it seek to maintain the people who are firm in their position? Does it pull over X percentage of people who are leaning? Like, what is the general analysis of the impact of strong comms in a situation like this? Do we get 5%? We get half a percentage point?
As the comms expert, I think start.
I think that it would take I think like if this were being a recommendation made to a campaign committee, which
Yes.
obviously this county is not, but if it were being made in like the context of the normal viability assessments we do for campaigns, it would be hard to recommend moving forward and investing money in communications and that sort of thing. With these numbers, I think it would be difficult to get campaign funders to throw in the amount of money it would take to feel confident about something when you're looking at the differences in intensity of support and things being below that 60% threshold, and the economic environment and all the different factors we discussed. But again, the consideration is a little different for the county because the county is not a campaign, and there are a lot of other different considerations to weigh So
Such as.
such as that the county has also heard sort of this odd middle ground where the county has heard from lots of different folks in the community that there are all these priorities that we support that we don't want to see cut. And when you offer ways to prevent those priorities from being cut, it's a pretty ambiguous answer right in the middle. And so I think that's a bit of a different calculation than just if it's a private campaign and you're saying, oh, can I convince funders based on my polling deck to throw in money? That's a different position to be in than a public entity that's saying, you know, our voters have told us on the one hand, they really prioritize these things and they don't want to see these things cut. And in some cases would like to see more funds directed to them, but also they're pretty ambiguous in terms of whether or not they would actually support something. That might be a case where it would make sense to say, well, let the voters decide and let them be the tiebreaker for something like a public entity that's making a referral and leaving it up to the voters rather than something like a privately funded campaign that's considering how am I going to raise millions of dollars and go gather signatures and do all these other steps. So that's what I mean when I say I think it's a bit of a different calculation.
Okay.
But, you know, I think candidly, it is a difficult economic environment. And I think one of the things to consider as we think about potential recommendations, potential next steps is odds, right? And, you know, doing nothing versus referring something, because I think a big overriding thing for me at the end of the day is, you know, by doing nothing, by referring nothing, there is a 0% chance of the county resolving its funding challenges without having to make cuts to programs that the public says it really values and causing, you know, morale issues and spreading county staff even thinner. Whereas by referring one of these potential options, it may not be a great chance, but it would be higher than a 0% chance. And that's a pretty different calculation for a public entity making referral from just if we were doing a viability assessment for someone who's thinking about, hey, do I go and try and raise the money and talk donors into putting money behind a signature gathering campaign and paid communications and all these other things that the county would not be able to do.
So Andy has a question and then I have a question after him.
Mine's not so much a question. I want to put my opinion out there. I base this on experience and also conversations and stuff. But I think while these are not perfect numbers or great numbers all the way across, I also think it's the best numbers we'll see in the next 4 years. So a lot of where my conversations over the next week and where I'm coming from is from that. I think as Manny said at the beginning, it is a part of Tabor to put things on the ballot and have a discussion with the public. That's part of reaching out, asking the public. Polling is part of it. Going to the ballot is part of it. I don't buy into this, oh, well, you were told no before, so you can never, ever put anything on the ballot again. The electorate changes every year. Polling, that's why polling changes every year. Elections change and
The
so
economy changes every year.
the economy changes every year, all of that. Personally, my opinion is that these are the best numbers we'll see for at least the next 4 years.
And that's because you want to run it on a presidential year, or is there something else that you're factoring in there that may be less obvious to see?
I think I have been convinced that even years and especially presidential years are
Okay.
the best years to.
Okay.
They are.
I wondered if you had a crystal ball and could also tell us more things. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's hard to forecast for what it's worth. And a lot of this, you know, I think as the polling presentation that Alex gave really clearly demonstrates is just tied to how people feel about their personal financial situation and the economy at large. And if I could forecast that accurately, I would have driven here in something nicer than my 2016 Impreza. I can tell you that.
And economically speaking, we just came off really high 8% inflation and now we're below 3%. And so depending on how inflation continues, that economic factor could change a little bit in November.
I was just gonna go off of what Jerry was saying about the specific things. Because the coroner's office worked between public health and public safety. And so, yeah, I think letting people know, I mean, because there's a lot of people I speak to in the public that I go, what do you do? You know, they come up with all kinds of things that we don't even do. But if there was something like death investigations or toxicology or autopsies, I think people are gonna see that. And almost everybody can relate to those. And so, I mean, I know it wasn't mentioned, but they could have thrown some numbers one way or the other too.
We did include that in
Yeah.
phase one. Now granted, phase one is not a quantitative instrument.
Mhm.
It's a smaller group of people, so it's not statistically representative. But we did include death investigations in particular,
Mhm.
along with just quite a long list of other similar
Yeah.
functions. So I just want to assure you that, you know, we were not, we didn't just cherry pick individual
Gotcha.
from departments, but we tried to be
Yeah.
as expansive as we could.
And I think that the education piece is really important to the public because, I mean, I run into it daily. People have no idea.
But what I'm hearing is that that's not going to be what we
Right,
rise or fall on.
right.
Which in a way is what it is, and just means that there isn't actually this massive lift that if we were to do it perfectly would
Yeah.
change
Mm-hmm.
the course per se, but
Yeah, and I do think that's fair for what it's worth. I think that, you know, in a scenario where the county chose to refer something and then it's just giving, neutral, public education information on what happens if this passes, what happens if it doesn't, what does each section of the ballot language mean, what would this money be used for if it was passed, things like that. You know, I don't think that, I think that's all important, and I think doing a poor job of that component would make things less likely to pass, because again, if people don't understand what the decision they're being asked to make, most voters, I think, very fairly will say, well, I'm just going to vote no because I don't understand what they're asking and I don't want to risk signing off on something that I don't fully understand. So I think doing a poor job of the public education component can certainly make something less likely to get approved. But I also think that there is a relatively low ceiling on how much like an absolutely perfect public education output could increase the odds of approval. I do think it's still very important because, you know, I think it's incumbent on the county, if it's asking voters to make a decision, to make that decision as clear and well explained as possible. So I think all of that is still well doing, and we're happy to, you know, go into more detail on that, maybe on Tuesday or in a forum where we have more time to talk about the public education side of
Let
things.
me just say though, it's so critical we have both. We can't just have one
Absolutely.
without the other. And that's why the investor side is key to this if we're going to push it over the finish line. And the numbers are sobering, I think.
They are.
Which doesn't mean that we may not move forward with some sort of funding mechanism. I mean, we'll talk more about that on Tuesday and with all of you.
And then Jerry has a
The
question.
last thing I was gonna mention is I know there's a couple of ballot questions that are being brought by citizens that are property tax cuts. And so my question is, if they're cutting property taxes, does the county go with retention questions versus sales tax questions? So in other words, that's something for the commissioners and you guys to recommend, but if you're having property tax cuts here and then sales tax questions here versus retention questions, how does that flow with everything else? And to me, it sounds like retention might make the better sense, like 2022 1A and a few others saying we're gonna retain money for public safety, retain money for road and bridge, or whatever, how it works, but rather than asking for more money, we're retaining the money we have. That's just a thought as you move forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great consideration and something that's definitely worth factoring in. And I would absolutely defer to SPA's expertise in terms of the potential impact of some of the statewide
Right.
ballot questions. What happens if they're approved? What happens if they're rejected? I suppose nothing changes, but so that's certainly worth considering. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that our recommendation has been focused primarily on should the county refer something in 2024 or not, but that's not to say that there's not a lot of learnings from this process that can be applied to future years. And so, you know, using the sales tax example, you know, if, you know, even if we're looking at 2024 and saying, well, in this environment, you know, it seems like not just in Jeffco, but all throughout the state, that it's not the right time to ask about a sales tax, or, you know, we could ask about a sales tax, but it might be rejected. I don't think that means that that is not something that should be on the table to revisit in future years. Again, a lot can change in 2 years. And I think that in different economies and environments, at least in other counties, in different economic environments, voters have been willing to consider sales taxes if they feel that what those sales taxes are being used for are worthwhile. And I think, to the point, there's also a lot of benefits to sales taxes in terms of just diversifying county revenues, so that all the eggs aren't so much of the property tax basket and things like that.
So Annette, before people leave, I want to make sure everybody understands the next steps
That's
and
what I was gonna have,
the
Mike.
timeframe.
Yeah.
It's really important that everybody understands what the next month looks like.
So
That's what I
Mike,
was
do you
gonna
want to?
I was gonna ask Mike,
Yeah,
you
so
can go over that.
been
Yeah.
in a series of these conversations with Bighorn and Aspect. So we'll meet with the Joe CMLT group on Monday, a similar presentation and discussion. And then on Tuesday, they'll make a slightly longer presentation in the briefing. We've got 2 hours blocked out for them, so that there's plenty of time to go through all of it and not have to rush like we did a little bit today. And then we've got some time reserved in future briefings, just because we know this isn't an easy question. So there might be further discussion. But the timeline in terms of when a decision has to be made is the very last, it has to be made in a hearing. And the very last option for that would be the July 23rd option. And that gives us enough time to notify the clerk, but we don't want to plan on sort of the last possible time. So the meeting before that is July 9th. That's what we're aiming for, because we all know something could happen, but on the 9th of it, sort of a worst case scenario, and we're not able to even have that meeting, right? Then we still have the backup in the timeline. So we're aiming for that decision on July 9th. But that gives us these sort of 3 briefing spots to have the discussion. That's really where it's like.
This would be Tuesday.
Tuesday briefings.
And one thing, I mean, we keep using the July 23rd as the last date. That's the last regularly scheduled BCC meeting. If for some reason the board chose to do a separate meeting for this, that is an option for the board. I just wanted to make sure our date is further in July for the clerk to notify the clerk. So that's the drop dead.
But it's like later that week, I think, the last one.
Yeah, but
So
And did you have one thing that?
I only just want to set it straight. The county does not pay for our guns. We all own our own guns. And then I will make the motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank
Agencies
you.
that they can buy their own guns. I just want to be really clear on that.
Wow.
I'm just bringing it.
Ridiculous.
Thank you for your presentation.
Buy me more, especially from
For a long time.
So if
Oh, wait, I
Prince
haven't done my
Alexis,
district 2 update.
road and bridge
So.
money passes, it goes in the road and bridge fund.
Anybody? All right.
I agree.